And there's someone in... Oh, I see. Mr. Mailer, are you out there?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, beauty. All right, I'm now going to welcome representatives from the National Farmers Federation and the New South Wales Farmers Federation, where we have Mr. Mailer via teleconference. So for the Hansard record, gentlemen, if you could please state your name and the capacity in which you appear today.
Yeah, Chris Groves, Chairman of the Farming Systems Committee at the National Farmers Federation.
Great.
Mark Harvey-Sutton, General Manager of Rural Affairs at the National Farmers Federation.
Robert Hardy, Policy Director, Environment, Cropping and Horticulture at New South Wales Farmers Association.
And to you, Mr. Mailer?
David Mailer, Chair of the Ag Science Committee for New South Wales Farmers.
Thank you very much. Now, the committee has received the New South Wales Farmers submission as submission number 8. So I'm saying to you, Mr. Hardy, do you wish to make any amendments or additions? Oh, yep, okay.
Farmers is number 8 and NFF is number 7.
Yep, thank you very much. Do you wish to make any amendments or additions to your submission?
Not to the submission, Chair, but I do have an opening statement.
I will come to you. I've just got to do the formalities first because we have received submission number 27 from the National Farmers Federation just this morning. So, Mr. Harvey-Sutton, do you wish to make any amendments or additions?
No, thank you, Chair.
All right, now, gentlemen, I'm going to offer you both...
Ask a question about the opening statement.
Yeah.
Is it coming out of the transcript of your submission? Because it really does chew up a lot of time in these committees where someone reads their submission out, or the body of their opening statement's already published in the submission, which is in the Hansard and available to us.
Well, Senator, I was just going to introduce myself, tell you a bit about what I do, where we farm and how we farm, and why chemicals are so important to our business. And
yeah, well, the answer is no. It's not in your opening.
Well,
it's
yes.
not in. It's not in the submission.
No, it's not. No, it's not covering what's in the submission.
That was the burden of my question. I'm asking you, was it in the submission?
So, gentlemen, it's over to you. Then I will hand to my colleagues to start the questions.
Righto. Senators, thank you. I'm Chris Groves. Thanks for the opportunity to appear before your inquiry. We farm at Cowra in the central western New South Wales. We run a mixed cropping business as well as a grazing enterprise. And our business has become very dependent upon being able to get access to appropriate technologies in the form of chemicals. Sometimes I wish we could have access to some of the products that overseas competitors do have, but with the structure that we operate on, we understand as an industry that everything has to have very sound science behind it. Personally, and as organisations, we have complete confidence in the APVMA and the way that they make their decisions. Connotations that a cost recovery model somehow leads the APVMA to be conflicted in its decision-making are baseless, because what we've seen has all been based on science. Having said this, I do acknowledge that sometimes something as serious as human safety is raised. We do have to take the issue very seriously, investigate it, and it is good to have the opportunity to discuss this with the senators. At the NFF, it is our job to ensure that on behalf of farmers, the regulator is operating as efficiently as possible to ensure that farmers have access to the most advanced technology possible and that the product that we use are safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Groves. Mr. Hardy?
Chair, in the interest of time and noting Senator O'Sullivan's admonition, I will refer you to the statement that's been submitted on behalf of the Association.
I have no problem if there's something that you do want to say outside of that or you want to reiterate.
I'm sure we'll come to it during the questions.
All right, very good. Just one thing I want you to put your mind around too, if you could, on behalf of your membership, and I've said very clearly, if anyone's coming here expecting to have a fight with me over the use of glyphosate, you're going to be bitterly disappointed. But I do want to raise this with you. And this committee was up to its neck in the Fenthian inquiry when APVMA, and the way that was handled was near on disastrous. So what I want you to contemplate, not for the fear of some politician coming out to try and tip it upside down and do a Four Corners episode on their own, but what if future markets, actually come to us and say, guess what, we're not purchasing your product if you're using glyphosate. Do you want to... Look, I'll go to my colleagues who are burning to ask questions. They're sick of hearing my voice, but I want to come back to that. Okay. All right, who wants to open the batting? Senator Brockman?
An answer to that question.
What about you, Senator Solomon? You happy to have an answer?
I'll yield to Senator Brockman.
Well, let's talk about that, you know.
I guess it just reiterates what you've asked, why the APVMA is such an important body for agriculture in Australia. Because they give us a sound science to justify the use of the chemicals that we do. It's fine for me to say to an emerging market or a market that, yes, Roundup, it's safe, supposedly it's safer than a cup of coffee, but there has to be some legitimate organisation that has done the testing that's scientifically based, and that is why an efficient APVMA is so important to agriculture. We can refer issues back to them and say, it's all been scientific work, there it is, there's our government statutory authority that does it.
Yeah, Mr Groves, I would like to have had more time with APVMA because I don't want to get in that situation again we faced with Fenthian and the, you know, because just to reiterate, as the senators would remember, you know, the industry was given plenty of notice that Fenthian's use was going to have a use-by date, so to speak, and not a lot of it was, yes, she'll be right.
Yeah, it doesn't
Well, it doesn't work that way. That's what I'm worried about.
Yeah.
And Senator, just to add to that, I do perceive that to be the real risk in this scenario. It's not so much the attitudes that our regulator has, it's the attitudes of those receiving markets and regulators there. So I suppose within the scope of this inquiry, certainly from Australia's perspective, having such a strong world-leading regulator puts us in good stead because there certainly is opportunity to present that evidence in those circumstances where markets might question access to products. But given we're such an export-exposed industry, that's really is where the real risk lies, and we've seen what's been happening in Europe. And so I take your question on and acknowledge that that's the real risk in this scenario, I think, with a lot of the products we use.
What about from the New South Wales Farmers Federation's point of view, Mr Hardy? And of course, not forgetting you out there, Mr Mailer.
Yeah.
Well, Chair, I'll yield to Mr Mailer insofar as the practical elements of where this goes, but I'd only echo the views of the NFF that had just been stated, that an independent regulator based on science is absolutely essential to giving over to the social licence. You know, farmers are genuine people out there doing their work every day, and they want to ensure that they're producing food safely, and they rely on people in other places doing things on their behalf, utilising science to ensure that they can continue doing what they're doing and operate within the social licence society is prepared to offer them.
Mr Hardy, before I go to Mr Baylor, I full-heartedly agree, but it didn't work that way with Fenthian. Okay, that's all I'm just trying to say, because, you know, we know the regulator will have the best brains, that we understand all that, but we also have to have a plan B. Where are we heading, just in case? And it was brought to my attention just recently that I believe the Shire of Canberra, no, I'm sorry, not the Shire of Canberra, what do you call it? No, what do you call it? The city of Canberra, the territory, sorry. That'll get me in the crap now, they'll be on to me. God almighty, that was a faux pas, I didn't mean that.
Yes, you did.
They recently banned, I believe, the use of phosphate in playgrounds and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
That's right?
Yeah.
It is the same Shire that spent $3.5 million castrating kangaroos in the Shire as well.
And they've still got to chase
I
them
mean,
down the road.
can I ask just a couple of qualifying questions, even though I said I wouldn't?
Yeah, of course you can. Just wonder how long it'd take to arc you up.
I'm a farmer. I farm and I run cattle and a number of other things. It is fair to say if we were to deny herbicides and pesticides, you couldn't, you just leave the tractor in the shed. You could not farm without some herbicides and pesticides to guide us through the challenge. Which would leave, and also there's an attitude, would you accept, among some of the political elite, that they won't be happy until we treat nutgrass with cold leftover tea made from natural herbal teas that have gently died on the vine and been processed for our use. Is that a fair description also?
It is. And Senator, look, we've got two extremes. We've got the element of people that believe everything should be as natural as possible, but then you've also got the fact that we've got to feed a world population. And without access to the technologies that we get, it's going to be impossible to produce.
So these same people sit in front of you, do they not, in cotton clothing and woolen skirts and leather shoes and
everything produced by farmers.
Correct. And in fact, there's not a single thing on earth, there's not a single physical thing in our life or our presence that doesn't start out from primary production, correct? Desk, chair, carpet, roof, generation of the light, the whole thing, 100%. So the point I want to make is when we have these types of, you know, some of it, and I'm not reflecting on the chair, but some of this is driven by complete nonsense to try and, you know, somehow they can, I mean, also you'd accept, Mr. Groves, as I have, the chemical in our lives, if you're not quite as old as I am, but I can remember 30 years ago dipping cattle and going up to have lunch soaked in dip, not knowing the dangers associated with it. Wash my hands, eat a meal with just soaking in dip liquid. Would you accept today that we are much more astute to the dangers, and in terms of practices on farm, there's a lot of label reading goes on, the appropriate equipment, you don't spray on windy days and a whole range of things?
It is. Just going back a step, I related a story to my son the other day. We had the contract dip man came in. And I said, I think when I was about your age, I fell in the dip. Yeah. It was an old diazonone-based dip. Just went home and had a shower and back to it. These days, you'd stand in the shower for an hour because you'd be that terrified of what would happen. I think the whole community has become a lot more aware of management of this issue. And something that's driving the farming community, going back to your question, Senator Stirl, about fentrithion as well, we are now, as organisations and as a farming community, very aware of our, and I hate the term, but social licence to operate. Because there are so many people watching everything we do. We are covering off on everything, making sure that as much as possible it is acceptable. I also have a fair bit to do with agri-politics and animal welfare, and it's something we're looking at there, is the fact that it has to be socially acceptable. And chemical usage definitely comes under that. We have to make sure that what we're doing is socially acceptable to the community so that it basically limits the opportunities people have to attack our businesses, our production systems, and the way we do things.
Yeah, and just to clear that up, Mr. Marlow, it's Glenn Stirl, sorry, I should have said that earlier, and I'm joined by Senator O'Sullivan, who used to bath in dip, and Senator Brockman. But as Senator O'Sullivan, you'll be aware, it won't be us three that will be attacking the industry. We cannot put our heads in the sand whether we like it or not. If future markets put these demand on us, we've got to be ready, just in case, and that's where I was going.
Definitely.
So, Mr. Mailer, please.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've got to keep in mind is the confidence that the APVMA gives the industry and operators within the industry to manage the $60 billion industry year in, year out. And confidence to do it safely, and confidence that their families and their staff and the people that work and operate in their businesses are safe within those businesses. And so the APVMA gives confidence not only to those businesses but to the public generally to operate and continue to operate to the benefit of the nation and the nation's wealth. And so I think that undermining and attacking the APVMA, which is demonstrated a very clear and conscious effort to protect not only the farming community and our markets, but also the wider Australian community and our international community, to ensure that we're operating safely, efficiently, and have available to us all the chemistry that allows us to beat some of the more insidious problems we face in this industry, including some of those problems that are actually introduced through our biosecurity measures, international biosecurity. It's essential that we have the APVMA operating to supply us with the latest chemistry. One of the difficulties we do face in our market, in the Australian market, is that we're such a small market globally, and the APVMA has got to walk a very tight balance between protecting us and our community and our wealth as a nation, but also ensure that we have access to the chemistry that actually makes sure that we're competitive, globally competitive. So I think that the APVMA, from a farmer's point of view and from an industry point of view, is doing a fantastic job to give us confidence that we're safe in our daily lives, our staff are safe in our daily lives, and we're producing the cleanest, greenest product globally. And the point that the Senator's made about the fact that everyone, whether they're wearing cotton clothes or woolen clothes or eating tomatoes or eating bread, they're actually engaged in farming. And that responsibility that comes to us as farmers, as producers, is not held lightly. And it was very disappointing to see the APVMA and the industry in the Four Corners report being attacked the way it was. The fact that they didn't produce a smoking gun in that report is really important. And what happened was what we expected to happen was that the issues around glyphosate in particular largely went away. But I think that there's an important message here that we need to actually understand is that we are part of the community. We are users of this chemistry, and we expect it to be safe, and we have confidence that our community is protected in that.
Thanks, Mr. Marlow. And just to reiterate, there's three senators at the table here that certainly aren't attacking APVMA. But my position is we want to continue for the APVMA to deliver the best possible outcomes to Australia's farming community. And my only concern was I just hope the relocation works, because this is not a time now to weaken or soften the fine work of the APVMA and the reliance upon the APVMA to Australia's food producers.
Chair,
So
if I might just add to
and that goes to my point,
Oh.
Senator, that we need to have an efficient process that actually engages with the chemistry in a timely manner that gives us confidence that we can actually meet our competitive advantages.
Absolutely, Mr. Marlow. Now, Mr. Hardy, you want to add something?
Chair, the thing I was going to add was that part of the social licence to operate that the industry faces is also about improving understanding of what farming systems are and what's actually involved in the production of clean, safe, fresh, reliable food and fibre. And it's an understanding in the community of the use, the benefits of innovation in chemistry, the speed with which bringing new chemistry can sometimes lead to reductions in the use of more harmful chemicals. So we need to have a regulator in place, APVMA or otherwise, which encourages innovation in the development of new chemistry, which can treat emerging pests and diseases, that can potentially lead to reduced use and reliance on chemicals, which means we can grow potentially higher yielding crops of fruit and vegetables or whatever the case is. So in many ways, the APVMA is the Therapeutic Goods Administration of the food and fibre sector, and we need to make sure that we have a properly functioning regulator to make sure when new developments come online, Australian farmers get access to them as quickly as our international competitors do.
Hear, hear. Cannot argue with that statement, Mr. Hardy. Now, Senator Brockman.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just a couple of quick ones. Mr. Groves, you mentioned in your opening statement that there were, you talked about the need to have access to appropriate technologies, and you said or you intimated that there were things happening overseas that you'd like access to that you don't necessarily have access to. Did you have anything in particular in mind when you said that, or was that?
Yeah, look, the one I was referring to was how long it took to get new technology registered to control internal parasites in sheep, because there was a lot of work went into that. We've got rapid development of resistance with internal parasites in livestock at the moment. There are technologies available overseas which we have not yet got access to here. There was one came on the market, an anthelminthic called Zolvic, and it took quite a bit to get it through the through the APVMA process. But I guess it goes back to what Senator Sterle said about making sure that we've got an efficient organisation. The other example I'll quote is the way the season is at the moment as well. It's throwing all sorts of strange things at us. I've had a phone call this morning that I've got to spray Roundup over a crop of barley because of the drought. There's a second growth coming through. The barley's just about on the point of harvest, but if I have to wait for the second growth to go, most of the original crop will have fallen out. So the agronomist has suggested I go over it now and put 2 litres of Roundup across it. It's those sort of things that are being thrown at us. The Roundup one, that's on label. You can use it at up to point of harvest. But if something came up that I had weeds that I couldn't kill with Roundup and had to get something approved, we need an efficient regulator that can be done reasonably quickly. That's just one example.
And can you talk us to your experience of how the system is going in that respect?
Yeah. The processes have been largely pushed so far by new technologies coming onto patent, coming under patent, and the companies considering it a worthwhile investment to get those new technologies registered. But as the process gets more expensive and the cost recovery model is a fairly expensive exercise for a chemical company to go through, I just hope as a farmer that it doesn't regulate some of the technologies that we may see available to us.
Senator, just to add to that, I mean, just for context, it's important to note, in a global scale, Australia is a pretty small market for a lot of these products, so that certainly contributes to that scenario.
So do you find, sorry, Senator Brockman, do you find them concentrating on getting approvals in the bigger marketplaces before they come into the Australian marketplace?
Anecdotally, yeah, that's my understanding, yeah.
And what's your view on the APVMA being able to rely upon regulatory process in countries like, Germany, the US, Canada and the likes, New Zealand?
I might pass that one over to Mr Hardy because I believe New South Wales did some work. New South Wales Farmers did some work on that very topic a little while ago.
We did. Senator, we very much support the reforms that are proposed to the APVMA, which will give it the opportunity to take into account the analysis which has been undertaken by international regulators insofar as approving use. There is still a need for the APVMA to consider the unique circumstances of Australian agriculture and how a particular chemical or veterinary medicine may be applicable in the Australian environment. But we believe that if some of the other constants can be assessed more quickly and then just simply looked at the Australian example rather than going through from A to Z to get the entire approval done, then that would speed that up. The double-edged sword potentially to this would be where it is then expected by those who, to take Senator Sterle's point, and pardon if I have incorrectly paraphrased you, but have an axe to grind against the chemical regulator in Australia, who then might argue that because a particular international regulator has made a particular label specification or has otherwise indicated how a chemical should be particularly regulated, that should then flow through into the Australian context. So it's important to make sure that there's an appropriate balance between referencing the approval process that has been relied upon internationally and the science that has been used to underpin some of those things, but then make sure that doesn't then mean that when for example, a European regulator coughs, that Australia necessarily catches a cold when it comes to the application of that chemistry in this market.
Senator, just to add to that, I was just going to say the APVMA at the moment also does a trade assessment or a market assessment when it assesses chemicals. And that's important to note because I think it acknowledged not other regulators don't necessarily service the same markets that Australia does. There's certainly members within our remit that would like to see that trade assessment remain, even with the acknowledgement of international processes. So, and that's pretty important. I mean, you can imagine a scenario where a product's approved in one country, but they may not export to the same markets we do. So that's important to be taken into account in that process.
If I could just add to the point that I made, New South Wales Farmers, in response to the Productivity Commission's recent report into the regulation of agriculture, which looked at the work of the chemical regulator, we did make the point, and it's in our submission on page 8, a quote there regarding the risk of politicisation from just making sure we get that balance correct when it comes to relying on international best practice in the regulation of chemistry in the Australian marketplace.
Does the industry have a sense on how, particularly those larger jurisdictions that Senator O'Sullivan mentioned, are tracking in terms of the balance of science versus politics? I know there's been some recent decisions in Europe that have made me question the scientific basis of some of the decisions that are being made there. Does the farming industry have a view on how things are going in this space internationally?
So my understanding is, Senator, that in Europe they employ a hazard-based assessment process. Now, I'm not an expert in that area, but I understand that it's kind of like the burden of proof is different in terms of how they assess it. So that's the EU scenario. In other Western or other advanced jurisdictions, I'm not entirely sure. I couldn't answer with any certainty, but certainly the Canadians seem to be highly regarded, as does the US. So anecdotally, I think there's a community within the international community that is highly regarded and viewed as world leading. So I think most of those jurisdictions would be looking to achieve the balance. But again, it does come down to what markets those countries and economies service as well.
Yeah, I think it's probably more of a comment than a question, but I think when ag talks about social licence, it always does concern me, and one of you said that it's not a term that you liked, but it's got to be a social licence based on the science, not on who can win the media
Not on
war.
emotion.
That's
Yes.
right.
Yeah. Well, Senator, we look forward to you and your next European delegation to the European Union defending that very point with some of your colleagues.
No one's invited me on one yet.
Well, I'm sure that
I keep waiting.
I'm sure that the invitation's somewhere in the mail.
Can we go to Europe?
If I had my way, I'd send both of you to Europe sooner than later. Can I? Sorry.
One way, unfortunately.
Did you want to ask anything before I have just one last?
No, you go.
Fine. Okay, thanks, Senator Brockman. So to both farming organisations, were you consulted over the governance board in relation to the APVMA? So let's go Farmers Federation.
Look, I'll have to pass that as far as New South Wales is concerned to Mr Hardy, because I've only been involved at New South Wales or Mark.
Yeah, we have been consulted, Chair. So I guess we've been, given that we're not directly cost recovered or direct funders of the APVMA, we have been, I guess, seeking guidance from those organisations that represent those chemical companies and veterinary medicines companies, and have been working quite closely with them. I did note the comment from the department before that they did have initial concerns, but they have been given assurances that a board wouldn't look at the policy that the APVMA does and those sort of things. So look, as long as that's the case and there's no detriment around the governance and the way decisions are made, I think we'd be broadly comfortable with it.
Sure. What about thanks, Mr. Harvey-Sutton. What about the New South Wales Farmers Federation, Mr. Hardy, or Mr. Mailer?
Chair, we haven't been consulted directly by the APVMA. However, we have been engaged in those discussions through the NFF and the Farming Systems Committee. So to sort of just make sure that the track is clear, as the New South Wales Farmers Association, we predominantly concern ourselves with what happens between the Murray and McIntyre rivers. Not universally, but predominantly. Where there are issues involving national regulators and others, we work with the National Farmers Federation as a founding member to ensure that our voice is heard. I might say that one of the issues we raised when we were briefly consulted about this was had been suggested either in an earlier iteration or otherwise that the governance board may have helped to resolve some of the challenges the APVMA had faced over the last little period. It had previously had an advisory board or governing council arrangement many years ago, and that was disbanded. I think from the industry's perspective, you would want to make sure that any governance arrangement or board or otherwise that was established would have very clear terms of reference and would have some key, whether it's oversights or whatever, to ensure that it wasn't simply a if you pardon the phrase, a jolly for those who are on it to come to Canberra and feel good and not necessarily have any tangible outcome for the industry.
Yeah, Mr. Hardy, you go think before you suggest that that's a high risk. I mean, these governance boards exist with as was the evidence of both the APVMA and the department, there's lots of them.
There are lots of government boards right across the government.
Yeah, and are you suggesting that, in your view, many of them exist to
well, we want to make sure
a jolly and a trip to Canberra? Because
well, I've had some experience.
I find
with
them
those.
very bizarre if they enjoyed coming to Canberra for anything.
Well, I enjoy coming to Canberra from time to time, Senator, but
You'll be in the ship.
the only observation I'd make is that I would recall many years ago this government undertook a process of consolidating and assessing the effectiveness of the raft of government boards and committees and other consultative fora to ensure that they were continuing to provide benefit to the people they were designed to provide benefit for. And I would just caution to ensure that in establishing something like this, that there was a tangible benefit for agriculture being derived from it, and it wasn't simply just another committee for the sake of another committee.
Former Senator Heffernan and well-respected and highly regarded chair of this committee used to refer to the Red Wine Club, which I thought was a bit harsh for everyone, but anyway, there you go.
Particularly for a white wine drinker.
Just one more from me, Chair?
Yes, yes, please.
We're still going, aren't we?
We are.
I guess looking forward in the regulatory space, have either of your organisations given any thought to the treatment of plant varieties, particularly created through the new genetic manipulation, tools of genetic manipulation, particularly how that intersects with chemical usage? Obviously, we've had the example in cotton where we've seen an 85% reduction in chemical usage through the use of GM cotton. Some of the new varieties of genetic manipulation obviously offer similar potential benefits in the future. Currently, genetically modified organisms are regulated under the Department of Health. Has the agricultural industry given any thought about whether at some point in the future we need to think about having at least some of those functions incorporated into an APVMA-like organisation? Perhaps it would need a different name, but has anyone got any views on that?
Yeah. When we had the GM canola debate 12, probably it might be 15 years ago, I think, there was a couple of problems with that in the fact that it was being driven by a multinational company and a lot of people saw the financial benefit going to them, not to our farmers. If that debate had been about a disease resistance or something like that, it wouldn't have been near the kerfuffle that it was. Bear in mind as well, I could probably breed Roundup Ready canola, but it would take me 20 years. We now have the technology to do it in one generation. And to maintain production and maintain the ability that we need to produce, we are going to need access to these better technologies. With regards to regulation, yes, it probably does need to be looked at by an agricultural-based organisation that understands our needs and our wants as far as that technology goes.
Senator, New South Wales Farmers has a strong pro-choice view with respect to genetic modification. It is farmers' choice, and we currently operate in a heavily regulated environment in New South Wales where the only two genetically modified crops you can grow are cotton and canola. In an effort to try and deal with some of the issues you've identified, earlier this year New South Wales Farmers stood up a new committee. We previously had an Agricultural Veterinary Chemicals Committee. We've now reformed that into an Agricultural Sciences Committee, which Mr Mailer is the chair of, with that very express purpose of identifying those future innovative and technological changes that aren't necessarily chemistry based but might be around plant breeding and other types of changes to genetic modification, genetic manipulation or whatever. We do have the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, which is established for the purpose of monitoring these sorts of trends. Whether that continues to be sufficient, I think is something that this committee will, I'm sure, continue to monitor through the usual processes of the Parliament. But I would say that if we are to feed and clothe half as many people on the planet again in the next 50 years, we are going to have to continually look for new and more innovative ways. It is not necessarily a question of turning more land over to productive purposes. It is a matter of lifting yields, consistently lifting yields on the space that we currently have. And in a lot of cases, the only way to do that is to change the plant breeding stock, if you like, to ensure that it lifts yield. And the point I'd make to the point that Senator O'Sullivan made earlier, we probably wouldn't be growing wheat in this country if it was not for innovative wheat breeding technologies in the late 19th century. And we should keep in mind that we have been, as a race of people, we have been using science to the benefit of feeding and clothing people for many thousands of years.
Just in this space, can I ask this question? It's always fascinated me. Mind you, I answer myself with confidence. But do you think that some of these people, this extreme left tofu-sucking crowd, really believe what they're saying? Or do you think they know and then they just sort of come up with a narrative that suits the campaign, right? If you don't understand the question, I'm happy to go back and start again and go into a bit of detail, right?
Senator, I can answer your question. Earlier this year, the New South Wales Farm Riders Association hosted a presentation from a gentleman by the name of Mark Linus. Now, Mark Linus is an author and has recently released a book where he's done a mea culpa on his view on genetic modification and claimed that he was wrong. 20 to 25 years ago, he was it's spelled L-Y-N-A-S, Senator Stirl.
The what, sorry?
Mark Linus, L-Y-N-A-S.
Okay.
I've got a copy of the book, I'll give it to you.
And he basically said that 25 years ago he was out intentionally destroying genetically modified crops and other science that was leading to increased productive capacity in agriculture, and he apologises greatly for doing it because he recognises now that he was wrong to do what he did. And that
so he was deliberately misrepresenting facts.
Well,
fabricating facts.
His view is that he had a conversion on the road to somewhere.
No, but I'm not interested in those. You know, I had an old boss who used to say to me, "It's not that he doesn't know is his problem; it's that he doesn't know is his problem." So I'm happy to give some level of forgiveness for fools, but I'm less tolerant for people who deliberately come out and misrepresent facts and campaign on. Well, I'll go back to the word fact, that they're not entitled to sort of put forward. So I'm interested from the farm organisations whether over time, in your, I suppose, in the challenge of trying to protect yourselves, whether you've come across this sort of evidence. So.
Senator, to your point about social licence, the point that Mr Groves made before, in all elements of farming, be it the way in which chemicals are used, the way we manage animal welfare, so animal husbandry practices, the way we deal with active land management and biodiversity on our farms, the way that we apply, every part of the farming system is coming under challenge from those who I suspect have a particular view about the way in which they'd like the world to operate. We see it in peri-urban agricultural environments where there's a challenge particularly around horticulture, where people want to live in a rural area but they don't necessarily want to have the smell and the sound and the sight of what actually living in an agricultural community might be like. This is a constant challenge for our sector to continue to educate people about where their food and fibre comes from.
Yeah, but the burden of my question is, my darling mother was a bigoted Catholic, right? And I used to say to her, Mum, if you'd have been born in China, you'd be a bigoted Buddhist, right? But she, and without reflecting on my mother, absolutely believed to the last word, right? So she was a true believer. She was a warrior in this case for her religious beliefs. But I can point to people who just don't believe one word that's coming out of their gob. My question to you is, because this is where organisations like the APVMA can come under attack, you know, insinuation that somehow they're in the corporate pocket and there's corruption and a whole range of things, right? Which then causes a crisis of confidence in people in the operation of the organisations. So my question is about people who really don't believe what they're saying, but are saying it nonetheless with some influence.
Senator, I think the only way we could possibly handle that scenario is if you can take everything off those people that's been produced by a system that they don't believe in.
Sure.
They wouldn't turn up to their protest rallies wearing a cotton shirt. They wouldn't
I
be
think-
able to have their soy latte because there'd be no soy produced.
I think they'd be handing out the social licences a bit more freely if the price of food doubles or if people
That's
start
right.
going hungry.
Yeah. And another big danger that we face, it's happening at a local government level. It won't be long and it'll be happening on a much larger scale with internet communications and things like that. Just recently, my daughter came across a request on the internet for people to go and sit in the back of a council meeting, and if you did, you got given a latte voucher for the nice cafe down the street. There's a whole mindset developing on getting numbers behind your cause, and it's a dangerous way that they're doing it. There's a possibility we will see that one scenario on a much larger scale when we start dealing with chemical usage or animal welfare or on-farm practices.
I was sent an email the other night from somebody where Tinder was being used by the World Wildlife Federation to defend koalas. Koalas had nowhere to go, so you should swipe right. Now that's lovely, but it distorts.
Yeah, no, I'm lost.
So Tinder's a dating app, and you swipe left if you don't like somebody, and swipe right if you do. I can't believe I've just said that into the Senate Hansard. And WWF was using this as an example of if you like koalas, swipe right, and if you don't like koalas, swipe left. And all these koala habitat is being destroyed by land clearing. Now, there's some of these things. It's to Mr. Groves's point. It's the misrepresentation in a lot of cases about the practice of farming that is.
Well,
not
of course, you're
helping
well aware
farmers.
how the World Wildlife Fund operates. They're funded by the big end of town. They're funded by the McDonald's and the like. We had this battle over beef, where they want them to be able to take them to a point where through market regulation, not government regulation, that they can put on the burger package, no cuddly little calves were killed in the process of making this tasty burger, right? It is complete deception. And where I'm interested in, both inside this area and outside, is where our peak farm organisations are going, whether they're starting to grow a set, if you like, because this business about being apolitical and we softly tread around the countryside, and I'm not suggesting they should get political, it's had very poor outcomes for the last 20 or 30 years. Very poor outcomes.
Senator, just
Can I make an observation here?
Sure.
I'll let Mr.
So
Marley.
David Mailer, the observation is that it's really easy for opponents or proponents of ideas to use fear, uncertainty and doubt as a strategy, and to see strategy that's used in business if you want to try and get advantage over a competitor that's got the runs on the board ahead of you. Fear, uncertainty and doubt is very hard to defeat, and the challenge that we face as agricultural industry, but also the challenge that government faces is to ensure that the fear, uncertainty and doubt is put in the hands of science to address rather than emotion.
Yeah.
And I think that both agricultural organisations and the industry generally need to walk side by side with our politicians and our governments to ensure that fear, uncertainty and doubt doesn't sway and run the program. That we point to organisations like APVMA and say, here is the science. If you can refute the science on science basis, not on emotion, you can actually point to peer-reviewed evidence to say this is where we're at, this is the problem, and the science is not correct. That's the only way forward. If we allow ourselves to be sucked down the wormhole of fear, uncertainty and doubt, we're all lost. And we need to have confidence not only in its industry but in our government to protect our backs as industry, because we do underpin a large proportion of the economy, the national wealth, which actually allows people to have 3 meals a day. It allows people to wear cotton clothes and woolen clothes and wear leather shoes. And so we need government to actually hold our backs as agricultural organisations, and not just up to us to defeat the fear, uncertainty and doubt that's being raised in this emotive debate.
Senator, just if I could just add something, and I completely endorse what Mr. Mailer said. I think he's hit the nail on the head. You know, to answer your original question, I think there is definitely an element of convenience. There are those that do believe those messages, and then there's those that take advantage of that, and we certainly see that. And I think what Mr. Hardy was talking about with Tinder, and I just like on the record, I've never used Tinder, I've never had to.
You're a chick magnet.
But what it does,
I'm in trouble for that now.
what it represents is an example of how insidious those messages are. It's clickbait. And it certainly does make it challenging for the sector when we are encumbered by evidence and facts. But I also think it's really crucial that we take a dignity in how we do that, and we continue to rely on evidence and facts. Certainly we need to work out how we challenge those examples of cutting through to audiences, but I certainly believe we need to maintain our integrity when we do that.
Right, okay, so we now have got to that time on our program. But look, thank you very much, gentlemen. Before I go, just one very quick one, or two. 13 years on this committee, I wonder who's going to be the bravest enough to put into the Senate inquiry into genetically modified products, but no one's taken me up on the challenge yet. Anyway, settle down, Tiger, settle down. Okay, and one last thing, Mr. Groves, you did trip and fall into the dip, you weren't shoved.
Sorry?
You actually tripped and fell in the dip, you weren't pushed?
No, I did fall in.
You weren't annoying the old man at the time?
No.
Okay,
I did actually trip on the edge of it and slipped, and yeah, head didn't go under, but pretty much went right in.
There you go.
Never forgotten it.
Tremendous. Thank you. Look, on behalf of the committee to the National Farmers Federation and New South Wales Farmers, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll now call Fazance.
Thank you.
I'm just going to go to the loo, mate, very quickly then. Okay, in 5 minutes. Okay.